His hand came out of nowhere. 1 second, I was standing alone in the dark hallway, pressing myself against the cold stone wall, trying to calm my racing heart. The next second, a large, warm hand closed around my wrist from behind, and I did the only thing my body knew how to do. I drove my elbow straight into his gut. Hard. The grunt that tore out of him was deep and rough, like thunder rolling through a closed room. He doubled slightly, and I spun around, ready to run, ready to scream, ready to do anything to get away. But then I saw his face, and my feet stopped working. He was tall, broader than any man had a right to be. His jaw was sharp, his dark eyes were watering slightly from the blow I had just delivered, and yet, instead of anger, instead of the cold fury I expected from a man of his rank and power, his mouth curved, slowly, dangerously. "Do it again," he said. I could not breathe. I could not speak. The Duke of Ashfern, the most feared, most untouchable, most coldly composed man in all of London, was standing in a dark hallway, rubbing his stomach, and smiling at me like I had just done something wonderful. "I beg your pardon?" I whispered. He straightened up, all 6 feet of him. His eyes dropped to my elbow, then came back up to my face, and something shifted in them, something that had no business being there. "No one," he said quietly, "has ever made me feel anything in a very long time." And that was how it all began. Now, before we go further into this story, tell me something. Has anyone ever caught you completely off guard and turned your whole world upside down in one single moment? Drop your answer in the comments. Tell us where you are watching from as well, because your support means everything to this channel. And if this story is already pulling at your heart, please hit the subscribe button for us right now. We are just getting started. His name was never supposed to mean anything to me. I had heard it whispered in drawing rooms, passed between gloved hands like a secret too hot to hold. The Duke of Ashfern, Dorian Ashfern. The man who had not smiled at a public gathering in 3 years. The man whose cold silence at any dinner table was enough to make grown lords suddenly remember urgent business elsewhere. The man whose dark eyes could strip a person down to their most honest self, without a single word leaving his lips. I had heard all of it, and I had told myself, firmly, the way sensible women tell themselves firm things, that none of it would ever concern me. I was Coretta Blaine, not a lady, not an heiress, the daughter of a once-respected physician who had left behind more books than money, more wisdom than property, and a reputation just respectable enough to secure me a position as a lady's companion in the household of Countess Delphine Moreau. I pressed linens, I read aloud, I answered letters, I smiled at the right moments, and stayed invisible at all the others. That was my life. Small, structured, and safe. The night everything cracked open began like every other evening at Morrow House. The Countess was hosting a card party. 30 or so guests filled the main salon, their laughter sharp and bright, their jewels catching the candlelight like tiny fires. My job was simple. Stand near the door of the side parlor, ensure the Countess had her shawl when she needed it, and refill the small dish of sugared almonds she kept beside her whenever she played cards. Invisible work. Invisible me. I had just come from the kitchen corridor, moving quickly through the back hallway that connected the service passage to the parlor. It was unlit, except for the pale wash of moonlight coming through the single high window above the staircase. I was walking fast, my mind already 3 steps ahead of my feet, thinking about the shawl, the almonds, the exact angle at which the Countess preferred her chair turned toward the fire. And then a hand closed around my wrist from behind. My body did not wait for my mind to catch up. Every nerve in me fired at once. I twisted, dropped my weight slightly the way my father had once taught me when I was 12, and he had worried, quietly, about a young girl walking alone through busy market streets, and I drove my elbow backward with everything I had. The impact landed solid. Stomach. Center. The sound that came out of the man behind me was not a yelp or a shriek. It was a grunt. Low. Controlled. Like someone who was accustomed to pain and had simply decided to acknowledge it briefly before moving on. I spun around, and the hallway, dim as it was, gave me just enough moonlight to see him. Dorian Ashburn was bent forward, one large hand pressed against his midsection, his dark coat perfectly pressed, despite the fact that I had just driven my elbow into him with the force of genuine terror. He was not a soft man. Even bent slightly at the waist, he was imposing. His shoulders were wide, his jaw was set, his dark hair fell slightly over his forehead, and his eyes, when they lifted to find mine, were the color of deep water on a cloudy day. And they were amused, not furious, not cold, not calculating the appropriate punishment for a companion girl who had just assaulted one of the most powerful men in England. Amused. "Don't creep up on me," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected, which was a miracle because my heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my ears. He straightened slowly. 6 feet of composed, titled, dangerous man, and he looked at me the way no one had ever looked at me before. Not through me, not past me, at me, fully, carefully. "Do it again," he said. 2 words. Quiet, unbothered. Like he had just asked me to pass the salt. "I beg your pardon?" The words fell out of my mouth before I could catch them. The elbow. He glanced down at his midsection, then back up at my face. "No one has caught me off guard in 11 years. Do it again." I stared at him. "Your Grace, I did not know it was you. I would never have—" "That," he said, cutting through my sentence without raising his voice at all, "is exactly why it worked. I did not know what to say to that. My mouth opened and closed once, which was mortifying, and I pressed my lips together and lifted my chin because that was all I had left. I must return to the Countess," I said. "I apologize for any discomfort I may have caused you." "You caused no discomfort," he said. "You caused interest." He said it so plainly, so simply, that I almost missed the weight of it. But it landed on me like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples went deep. I left before he could say anything else. I walked back to the parlor, placed the shawl over the Countess's shoulders, refilled the almonds, and stood in my corner, with my hands folded and my face carefully blank. But the back of my wrist, where his hand had closed around it in the dark, felt warm for the rest of the night. I told myself it was from the shock. I almost believed it. The next morning came gray and damp, the kind of London morning that pressed against the windows like it wanted to come inside. I was in the Countess's writing room, sorting her correspondence, when Delphine Morrow swept in, wearing an expression I had come to recognize. It meant news. It meant something had shifted in the complicated weather system of her social world. "He is staying," she announced. I looked up. "Who, my lady?" "Ashburn." She dropped into her chair and reached for her tea, as though she had not just said something that made the air in the room change. "He accepted my extended invitation. He will remain at Morrow House for the full fortnight of the country gathering. I sent the invitation as a formality. He never accepts." She paused. "He has never once accepted." She looked pleased, surprised, but pleased. I looked back down at the letters in my hands and kept my face very still. "How wonderful for you," I said. It was not wonderful for me. A fortnight was 14 days. 14 days of moving through the same halls, eating in the same house, breathing the same air as Dorian Ashburn. 14 days of being invisible while also knowing that the man who had looked at me last night in the dark had looked at me like I was anything but. I was being dramatic. I was a companion. He was a duke. Whatever strange energy had passed between us in that hallway was simply the product of shock and moonlight, and nothing more. I repeated that to myself several times. It helped less each time. He appeared at breakfast, which surprised everyone. Dorian Ashfern at a breakfast table meant 12 people suddenly sitting up straighter, choosing their words more carefully, laughing a little too brightly at things that were not especially funny. He sat at the far end, said almost nothing, drank his coffee, and read a folded letter that he kept beside his plate. I was not at the table. I ate in the small room off the kitchen, as was appropriate for my position. But I passed the dining room doorway twice on errands, and both times I kept my eyes forward. The second time, I failed. I glanced in. Just once. Just a second. He was already looking at the doorway. He saw me, and he did nothing. He did not nod, did not smile, did not give any outward sign that he recognized the woman who had elbowed him in the stomach the night before. He simply held my gaze for exactly 3 heartbeats, then looked back down at his letter. 3 heartbeats. I counted them, which meant I had slowed down, which meant I was an absolute fool. I kept walking. The country gathering was a thing of noise and performance. Over the following 3 days, guests arrived in waves. Carriages rolled up the gravel drive, trunks were unloaded, introductions were made, and Morrow House filled up with the particular kind of energy that comes when ambitious people are placed in a beautiful house with too much wine and too little to do except watch each other. I watched all of it from the edges. There was Lord Pemwick, a red-faced baron who laughed too loudly and watched the younger women too carefully. There was Lady Silvara Cheston, thin and precise, whose compliments always had a small blade hidden in them. There were the Aldbourne sisters, twins named Fay and Petra, who were lovely and warm and completely at war with each other over a young viscount named Callum Reeves, who seemed unaware that either of them existed. There was Mr. Tobias Fenwick, a solicitor of good reputation who had arrived as someone's guest and spent most of his time looking like he wished he had not come. There was Mrs. Honoria Gratch, the Countess's older cousin, who declared herself hard of hearing when conversations bored her, but could catch a whispered secret from across a full salon. And there was Lady Rosamond Pell, widowed young, exquisitely beautiful, who had positioned herself beside Ashfern at every possible opportunity since her arrival. I noticed. I was not supposed to notice. But I did. Lady Rosamond was everything the world said a duke should want. She was polished and graceful, her conversation elegant, her laughter never too loud, never too quiet. She touched Ashfern's arm when she spoke to him. She angled her body toward him at the table. She smiled at him with a warmth that seemed genuine, or at least convincing. He listened to her. He was polite. He was always polite. But polite was the word. Not warm, not interested. Polite the way a wall is polite. Present, solid, and giving nothing back. On the 4th day of the gathering, I was sent to the East Library to retrieve a specific volume of poetry the Countess wanted for an evening reading. The library was quiet and smelled of leather and old paper, the kind of smell I had loved since childhood. I found the shelf, found the book, and was turning to leave when I walked directly into someone coming around the end of the shelf from the other side. The book flew out of my hands. We both reached for it. Our hands landed on it at the same time. I looked up. Dorian Ashfern looked down. Neither of us moved for a moment. The book was between our hands, his fingers overlapping mine on the spine, and the library was very quiet, and I was very aware of how close he was standing. "Miss Blaine," he said, calm, like he had been expecting this. "Your Grace." I straightened and released the book. He released it also, and it nearly fell again, which almost made me laugh, which would have been a disaster. "You know my name," I said. and then immediately wished I had said something else, because it came out sounding startled, which I was, but I did not want him to know that. "I made inquiries," he said simply. That stopped me. "You made inquiries? About me? You elbowed me in the stomach," he said, and there was something in his voice, not quite a smile, but close to one, close enough that I felt it in my chest. "I wanted to know who you were. And now you know," I said carefully. "A physician's daughter, a lady's companion, no family of consequence, no fortune, no title, nothing worth your attention, your grace." He looked at me for a long moment. The afternoon light from the high library windows was falling across one side of his face, and for the first time I saw him without the shield of a dinner table or a crowded room between us. He looked tired, I thought, not from lack of sleep, but from something older, something he had been carrying for a long time. "That," he said quietly, "is the second time you have told me what I should or should not find worth my attention." I opened my mouth. "The first was in the hallway," he continued. "When you assumed I would be angry with you, I was not. You told me to elbow you again," I said. "That is not a normal response from any person, let alone a duke." "No," he agreed, "it is not." He said nothing else. He seemed content to let the silence sit between us, which was infuriating, because silence does not bother men like him. Men like him use silence as a weapon. I had seen it at the dinner table, seen how the quiet around him made others rush to fill it with chatter, with offerings, with performances of themselves. I refused to perform. "What do you actually want, Your Grace?" I asked. Direct, perhaps too direct. The Countess would have been horrified. He tilted his head slightly, like the question had surprised him, or pleased him, or both. "I am not entirely sure," he said. "That is also not a normal experience for me." The honesty of it disarmed me completely. I had been ready for deflection, for charm, for the practiced social armor that men of his rank wore as naturally as their coats. I had not been ready for that, for the quiet, unguarded truth of a powerful man admitting that something had unsettled him. I picked up the book of poetry firmly and tucked it under my arm. "I must return to the Countess," I said, for the second time in as many days. "Of course," he said, and he stepped aside to let me pass. I walked out of the library without looking back, but I was 3 corridors away before I realized I had been holding my breath since the moment our hands had touched on the spine of that book. That evening, the Countess decided to host an impromptu musical gathering in the drawing room. Half the guests played or sang with varying degrees of skill, and Mrs. Honoria Gratch declared each performance magnificent, regardless of quality, which everyone appreciated. I sat near the back, as always, half listening, half watching the room the way I always did. Watching was a skill I had developed out of necessity. You learned a great deal about people when they believed no one was paying attention. Lady Rosamond sat beside Ashfern on the settee near the fire. She leaned slightly toward him when she spoke. He sat straight, his long fingers resting on his knee, his expression attentive but sealed. Lord Pemwick was watching the younger Aldbourne sister, Petra, in a way that made my skin uncomfortable. Mr. Tobias Fenwick had placed himself in the corner farthest from the piano and was nursing a glass of wine with the devotion of a man using it as an anchor. Callum Reeves, the young Viscount, sat between the Aldbourne sisters like a man who had made a terrible seating decision and knew it. And then there was a woman I had not seen before. She had arrived late to the gathering, slipping in just before supper, and the Countess had greeted her with a warmth that suggested she was important, or at least useful. Her name was Mrs. Dotty Vance, a widow of middle years with sharp green eyes and a mouth that smiled easily but revealed very little. She sat across the room from Ashfern, and I noticed, because I noticed everything, that she watched him with the particular attention of someone who already knew something about him that the rest of the room did not. It made me uneasy in a way I could not name. The musical evening wound down slowly. Guests drifted toward the card tables or the supper room. I was gathering the Countess's things when I became aware of someone standing just behind my left shoulder. I turned quickly. It was not Ashburn this time. It was Mrs. Dottie Vance, and she was looking at me with those sharp green eyes in a way that felt like she was reading something written on my face. "You are Miss Blaine," she said. Not a question. "I am," I said. "Coretta Blaine, the late Dr. Blaine's daughter." Something in my chest stiffened. "You knew my father?" "Of him," she said carefully. "Everyone in certain circles knew of your father. He was a man of unusual principles." She paused. "He also had enemies, for precisely that reason." The room suddenly felt smaller. "What are you saying?" I asked quietly. Mrs. Vance smiled, but her eyes did not change. "Only that you should be careful, Miss Blaine. This house has more moving pieces than it appears. And some of those pieces have been placed very deliberately." She glanced across the room. I followed her gaze. She was looking at Ashburn. Then she looked back at me, nodded pleasantly, and walked away, as though she had said nothing of any consequence at all. I stood very still for a moment. Then I looked at Ashburn across the room. He was already looking at me, and for the first time, the warmth I had been trying to dismiss all week shifted into something else, something edged and careful and afraid. Because something was happening in this house, and I did not yet know whose side anyone was on. I did not sleep that night. I lay in my narrow bed in the small room at the end of the east corridor, staring at the ceiling, turning Mrs. Vance's words over and over in my mind like stones I was searching for something underneath. "Your father had enemies. Some of those pieces have been placed very deliberately." And then she looked at Ashburn. What did that mean? Was he a threat? Was he a piece on someone else's board, moved into this house for a purpose I could not yet see? Or was Mrs. Vance herself the piece, placed here to watch, to warn, or to manipulate? I sat up before dawn, pulled my shawl around my shoulders, and lit my small candle. I opened the worn leather journal my father had left me. I did not read it often. It hurt too much. But tonight I needed his voice, even if it only came through ink and paper. His handwriting was small and precise, a doctor's handwriting. Every word controlled, every thought finished completely before the next one began. I turned to a page near the back, one I had read so many times. The paper had softened at the edges. He had written, "There are men who collect power the way others collect art. They do not use it. They simply need to own it, and they will crush anything that threatens to take it from them." I closed the journal. My father had written those words 2 months before he died. His death had been ruled a sudden illness, a fever that came fast and left him gone within 4 days. The physician who attended him was a man I had never met before and never saw again afterward. I had been 19, and grief had swallowed everything, and I had not asked the questions I should have asked. I was asking them now. I dressed before the household stirred and went down to the kitchen garden, needing air, needing space to think. The morning was cold and still, the grass wet with dew, the sky just beginning to lighten at the edges, from black to the deep gray of a London dawn. I was not alone. Ashburn was standing near the garden wall, his coat on, his breath making small clouds in the cold air. He was looking out over the fields beyond the wall, and he did not hear me at first. For a moment I saw him the way he never let anyone see him in company, still, unguarded, something in his posture that looked almost like grief. Then he turned, and the stillness closed over him again, like water closing over a stone. "Miss Blaine," he said. "Your Grace." I stopped a few feet from him. I did not know anyone else was awake. I rarely sleep past 4, he said. He looked at my face. You did not sleep at all. It was not a question, and I did not bother denying it. Mrs. Vance spoke to me last night, I said, instead. I had decided somewhere between the candle and the garden that I was done waiting for information to come to me. She said my father had enemies. Then she looked at you. Something shifted in his expression. Not guilt, not surprising, something more complicated than either. Come away from the house, he said quietly. That should have frightened me. Every sensible rule I had ever been taught said that a woman alone should not follow a powerful man away from sight and company. But my father had also taught me to read people, and what I saw in Dorian Ashfurn's face in that cold early morning light was not a threat. It was urgency. I followed him along the garden wall to the far corner, where an old stone bench sat under a bare oak tree, out of sight of the house windows. He did not sit. He stood with his arms crossed and looked at me with an expression that had finally dropped all its careful layers. Your father, he said, was my physician. For 3 years before his death, he treated me for a condition I have never made public, a weakness in my chest that comes and goes. He was the only doctor I trusted with it. I stared at him. I did not know that. He would not have told you. He was extraordinarily discreet. He paused. When he died, I had doubts about the manner of it. I pursued those doubts quietly, privately, over the last 4 years. My heart was beating very hard. What did you find? Enough to know that his death was not natural, he said, and enough to know that the man responsible is currently a guest in this house. The garden went very quiet around me. Who? I asked. My voice was barely above a whisper. Lord Pemwick, he said. Lord Pemwick. The red-faced baron with the too loud laugh and the uncomfortable gaze. The man I had already disliked on instinct from the moment he arrived. Why? I managed. Your father had documents, Ashfurn said. Medical records, but also observations. Notes on conversations he had overheard. Things patients had said. Patterns he had noticed about certain financial arrangements involving men of title and the questionable deaths of inconvenient people. He was building something, evidence of a kind, and someone found out. The words hit me one at a time, each one heavier than the last. My father had not simply died. He had been silenced. I sat down on the stone bench because my legs made the decision before I did. The cold of the stone went straight through my skirt, but I did not move. I pressed my father's journal against my chest, the one I had brought out without thinking, and I looked up at Ashfurn, standing over me in the pale morning light. You came here, I said slowly. You accepted the Countess's invitation, which you never do. You came because Pemwick was going to be here. Yes, he said. And then you found me. I did not know you would be here, he said, and something in his voice changed, became softer, more careful. Finding you was not part of any plan, Miss Blaine. Finding you was something else entirely. I looked down at the journal in my hands, my father's words, my father's handwriting, my father's enemies, now standing 20 feet away inside that warm and deceptive house. What do you need from me? I asked. Nothing, he said immediately. You are not involved in this. I will handle Pemwick through legal means, through the connections I have built over 4 years. You do not need to see. He killed my father, I said. The words dropped between us like something solid. Ashfurn went quiet. Tell me what you need, I said again. And this time my voice did not shake at all. He told me about the letters. My father, it turned out, had not kept all his observations in the journal he left me. There was a second record, a set of letters, written in careful language that looked like ordinary correspondence but contained, hidden within specific phrases and word patterns, detailed accounts of what he had witnessed. Those letters had been sent to a single trusted contact for safekeeping. That contact was Mrs. Dottie Vance, which explained everything about her sharp green eyes and her careful warning the night before. She was not a threat. She was a guardian. She had been holding my father's letters for 4 years, waiting for the right moment, waiting for someone with enough power and enough proof to act on them. Ashfern had found her 6 months ago. Together, they had arranged to be at this gathering, knowing Pemwick would attend because Pemwick always attended Countess Morrow's gatherings. It was where he conducted a great deal of his quiet, dangerous business. I sat with all of this settling over me like cold water. "So, Mrs. Vance knows who I am," I said. "She has known for some time," Ashfern said. "She was your father's friend. She wanted to find you, but she needed to be certain you would be safe before she made contact." "And am I safe?" I asked. He looked at me for a long moment. "That depends on whether Pemwick knows you exist." The way he said it made something cold move through my chest. "Does he?" "I do not know," Ashfern said honestly. "Your father kept you separate from all of it, deliberately. He never mentioned you in any document connected to his investigation. He protected you very carefully." My throat tightened. Of course he had. That was exactly who my father was, protecting me, quietly, even while he walked towards something dangerous, even while he must have known the risk he was taking. I pressed my lips together and held everything steady. "What is the plan?" I asked. Ashfern looked at me with an expression that was beginning to feel familiar. That particular combination of assessment and something warmer underneath it. Something he had not entirely decided what to do with yet. "Tonight," he said, "Pemwick will attempt to meet privately with a man named Silas Grout. Grout is his intermediary, the person who carries his instructions and payments to others. Grout arrived yesterday as part of the serving staff. False references. I have already confirmed it. He planted someone in the house," I said. "He always does," Ashfern said grimly. "It is how he operates. He never dirties his own hands. He gives instructions through Grout. Grout finds the appropriate person, and Pemwick sits at dinner and laughs too loudly, and no one ever connects him to anything." I thought of my father, of the unknown physician who had appeared and disappeared, of the fever that had come from nowhere. "What happens tonight?" I asked. "Mrs. Vance will position herself to overhear the meeting between Pemwick and Grout. She is skilled at this. She has done it before. What she hears, combined with the letters she already holds and the financial records I have gathered, will be enough to take to the magistrate." "And my role?" I asked. "You have no role," he said firmly. "You stay close to the Countess, you behave as you always do, and you let me handle this." I looked at him. "You came to this house because of my father. Those letters exist because of my father. I have the right to be part of this. You have the right to be alive at the end of it," he said, and there was something raw in his voice that he did not quite cover in time. The garden was fully light now. Somewhere inside the house, the sounds of the household waking were beginning, footsteps and rattled trays, and the distant voices of the kitchen staff. I stood up from the bench. "I will stay close to the Countess," I said. "But if I see or hear anything, I will not pretend that I did not." He looked at me for a long moment. Then, very slowly, he nodded. We walked back toward the house separately. Me first, then him, a careful few minutes between us. The kind of careful that meant we both understood something had shifted, something that had nothing to do with letters or magistrates or dead men's evidence, and everything to do with cold stone benches and early morning light, and the way he had said alive like it mattered to him personally. I spent the morning doing my usual tasks. Letters, errands, the Countess's endless small requirements. But I was watching. Every room I passed through, every corridor, every face. Silas Grout was easy to identify once I knew what to look for. He was a lean, quiet man of about 40, working in the role of an underfootman, carrying trays and opening doors, with the practiced invisibility of a professional. But his eyes were wrong. Servants' eyes move differently. They track what is needed, what is spilling, what must be anticipated. Grout's eyes tracked people. Specifically, they tracked Ashfern. He was watching the Duke. That sent a cold thread of alarm through me that I spent the rest of the morning trying not to pull too hard. At luncheon, Lord Pemwick was in loud and charming form, dominating the conversation at his end of the table with a story about a fox hunt that grew more elaborate with each telling. Lady Silvara Cheston watched him with a faint smile that said she found him useful. The Aldbourne sisters laughed at his story because it was easier than not laughing. Mr. Tobias Fenwick stared at his soup. Callum Reeves tried to catch Petra Aldbourne's eye and caught Faye's instead, which created a small, silent catastrophe that only I seemed to notice. Ashfern ate in composed silence at his end of the table, contributing a precise and well-chosen comment every so often. Enough to be present, not enough to be available. Lady Rosamond sat beside him again. I watched her lean in to say something private. I watched him listen, respond briefly, and return to his wine. Across the table, Mrs. Honoria Gratch declared the soup magnificent and asked if someone could repeat what the fox hunt story had been about, as she had not quite caught it the first time. The afternoon passed with terrible slowness. Then, at 3:30, everything moved at once. I was crossing the upper landing with a stack of the Countess's mended correspondence when I heard voices from behind the closed door of the small writing room at the end of the hall. That room was supposed to be unoccupied. I knew the household schedule. Everyone with any reason to be upstairs was either in the garden or the main drawing room. I stopped. The voices were low, but the door was old, and the wood had warped over the years, and it did not seal cleanly at the bottom. I recognized Pemwick's voice first. The cadence of it, even stripped of his public bluster, was distinctive, flat and precise underneath the performance. The voice of a man who planned. The other voice was Grout, quieter, faster, delivering information the way a machine delivers output. I stood very still and listened. "He has the financial records," Grout said. "From what I have confirmed, he has 3 years of transfers traced back to the accounts." "That is manageable," Pemwick said. "Records can be disputed. Records require interpretation. What I need to know is whether he has testimony." A pause. "There is a woman," Grout said. "Mrs. Vance. She has been in contact with Ashfern for several months. I believe she is holding documents." D. "Then Mrs. Vance becomes a problem that needs solving," Pemwick said. Calm, easy, like he was discussing a scheduling conflict. My blood went cold. "And Ashfern himself?" Grout asked. Another pause. Longer this time. "Ashfern is more complicated," Pemwick said. "He is public, titled. His disappearance or sudden illness would draw attention we cannot afford right now. We discredit him first. Then, if necessary, we remove him." Remove him. The word sat in my chest like a blade. I backed away from the door on silent feet, moving carefully, keeping my breathing steady until I was around the corner and out of earshot. Then I pressed myself against the wall and closed my eyes for 3 seconds. Pemwick knew about Mrs. Vance. Pemwick was already planning his next move. And Ashfern did not know that the danger had escalated, that it had moved from evidence gathering to something far more immediate and far more deadly. I had to find him. I moved through the house quickly, staying in the back corridors, the servant passages, the routes that kept me out of the main rooms, and away from eyes that might wonder why the Countess's companion was moving with such purpose and such speed. I found Ashfern in the library. He looked up when I came in, and whatever he saw on my face made him set down his book immediately and stand. "Close the door," he said quietly. I closed it. And then I told him everything I had heard, word for word, the way my father had taught me to recall things accurately, without embellishment, without skipping the parts that frightened me most. When I finished, the library was very quiet. Ashfern's jaw was set. His eyes had gone very dark. He was not afraid, I realized. He was angry, in the controlled and dangerous way that certain men are angry, the kind that does not shout or break things, but simply becomes very, very focused. "Mrs. Vance," he said. "She needs to be warned tonight," I said, "before any meeting happens. If Pimwick has already decided she is a problem—" "I know," he said. He was already moving toward the door. He stopped when he reached me. We were very close in the narrow space between the shelves and the door, and he looked down at me with an expression that had gone past composed and past controlled and arrived somewhere much more honest. "You were supposed to stay close to the Countess," he said. "And if I had," I said, "you would not know what Pimwick is planning." He looked at me for a long moment. "No," he said quietly, "I would not." He reached out, and for a moment I thought he was going to touch my face, and I did not breathe. But his hand went past my cheek and gently, carefully pressed the stack of correspondence I was still holding more securely under my arm, as though reminding me I had a cover, a role, a reason to be moving through this house. It was such a small gesture, practical and quiet. It undid me more than anything else he had done. He opened the library door and walked out, with the easy, unhurried pace of a man who had nowhere in particular to be. I waited 30 seconds, then followed, going the opposite direction, back toward the Countess's rooms, my heart hammering, my mind racing, and somewhere underneath all of it, a feeling I had absolutely no business feeling pressing itself quietly and stubbornly against my ribs. Tonight, everything would either hold together or fall apart. And for the first time in 4 years, I was not facing it alone. The evening arrived dressed in candlelight and false warmth. The Countess had arranged a dinner more elaborate than any previous night. 12 courses, the good silver, the crystal glasses that caught the light and threw small rainbows across the tablecloth. She was in excellent spirits. The gathering was going well by her measure, meaning no one had quarreled openly. The wine had not run short, and the Duke of Ashfern was still under her roof, which elevated the entire event in the eyes of every guest. I moved through my duties with careful precision. Shawl, correspondence, the small adjustments the Countess needed, without asking. I was so practiced at invisibility that even on a night when my heart was beating twice its normal speed, no one looked at me twice. Except Ashfern. Across the length of the dinner table, from his seat at the far end to my position near the wall behind the Countess's chair, he found me 3 times. Each time, his gaze held for just a second. Each time, I gave the smallest nod to tell him I was steady. I was not entirely steady, but I was present, and that was enough. Mrs. Vance sat 4 seats down from Lord Pimwick, and she ate her dinner with the serene composure of a woman who had not been told that a dangerous man had already marked her as a problem requiring a solution. Ashfern had not yet found a way to reach her privately. The afternoon had offered no safe moment. The house too full, too watchful, too many ears in every corridor. It had to happen before the evening was over. Lord Pimwick was performing magnificently. He told 2 more stories, both of them well-constructed and entertaining, and the table laughed and refilled their glasses, and looked at him with the warm approval that charming men in good company always seem to generate, regardless of what they carry underneath the charm. Lady Silvara Cheston engaged him in a conversation about property values in the north that seemed entirely innocent and probably was not. Mr. Tobias Fenwick had finally relaxed enough to contribute to the conversation, drawn out by Callum Reeves, who turned out to have a genuine and disarming openness that made people want to talk to him. The Aldbourne sisters had declared a temporary ceasefire and were being perfectly pleasant to each other, which Mrs. Honoria Gratch declared a miracle and celebrated by having a third glass of wine. Lady Rosamond, seated beside Ashburn as had become her habit, was more subdued than usual. She spoke less, ate carefully, and I noticed her eyes moving around the table with a sharpness that did not match her usual performance of elegant ease. She was watching something, or waiting for something. I filed that away and kept moving. After dinner, the party separated. The gentlemen stayed for port. The ladies moved to the drawing room for tea and conversation. I served the tea, collected the cups, adjusted the fire screen when Lady Silvara complained of a draught, and watched the clock on the mantelpiece with a patience I was manufacturing from nothing. At 9:30, Ashburn appeared in the drawing-room doorway, having rejoined the ladies with the other gentlemen. He moved through the room with his usual composed ease, spoke briefly with the Countess, accepted a cup of tea he did not drink, and drifted gradually, naturally, toward the window seat where Mrs. Vance had positioned herself slightly apart from the main group, with a small book open in her lap. I watched him sit beside her. I watched them speak, both of them looking forward, both of them appearing to be doing nothing more than sharing a quiet moment away from the louder conversation in the center of the room. Their lips moved minimally. Their expressions did not change. Whatever he told her, she received it without flinching. She simply turned one page of her book, nodded very slightly, and smiled at nothing in particular. She was extraordinary. I exhaled slowly and turned back to the Countess. Pemwick entered the drawing room 20 minutes later, and I felt the change in the air the way you feel a weather shift before the rain actually arrives. He came in smiling, glass in hand, surveying the room with the easy confidence of a man who believed himself to be the most dangerous person in any space he occupied. He was probably right. His eyes moved around the room. They landed on Mrs. Vance for just a moment, long enough to confirm her location, then moved on. They landed on Ashburn for slightly longer, and something in his expression adjusted almost imperceptibly. Not concern, calculation. Then his eyes found me. I do not know why they stopped. I was in my corner, in my role, invisible in all the ways I had spent years perfecting. But they stopped, and for 3 long seconds Lord Pemwick looked at me with an expression I could not immediately read. Then he smiled pleasantly and looked away, and every instinct I had went completely cold. He knew who I was. I did not know how, I did not know when he had found out, but I felt the truth of it, the way you feel the edge of something sharp before you fully understand you have been cut. He knew I was Dr. Blaine's daughter, and he had just looked at me and filed that information into whatever plan was already moving inside his head. I needed to get to Ashburn. The room made it impossible. There were too many people, too many eyes, too many social currents that I could not cross without drawing exactly the kind of attention that would make everything worse. I stayed in my corner. I kept my face smooth. I watched. 40 minutes later, the Countess declared herself tired and rose to retire for the evening. That was my signal, my purpose, my reason to move. I collected her things, helped her say her goodnights, and followed her out of the drawing room. In the corridor, I settled the Countess into the care of her personal maid, excused myself to return a forgotten item to the drawing room, and went instead directly to the back hallway. The same hallway where it had all started. I had barely reached it when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned fast. Silas Grout stepped out of the shadow near the service door. He was not carrying a tray. He was not performing any household function. He was simply standing there, in the dark, blocking the way back to the main house, and his eyes were flat and purposeful in a way that confirmed everything I had feared. "Miss Blaine," he said quietly, "Lord Pemwick would like a word." "I have nothing to say to Lord Pemwick," I said. My voice came out steady. I was very proud of that. "That is all right," Grout said. "He has plenty to say to you." He took one step toward me, and from the other end of the hallway, a voice said, "I would stop there." Dorian Ashfern stepped into the hallway from the far door. He was not hurrying. He was not dramatic. He walked with the same composed, unhurried certainty he always carried, and he placed himself between me and Grout with the simple, absolute finality of a man who has made a decision and is completely at peace with it. Grout stopped. "You are trespassing in this house under a false identity," Ashfern said to him, his voice low and conversational. "I have 2 witnesses to your earlier conversation with Lord Pemwick. I have a magistrate's contact arriving at this house tomorrow morning at 9, at my invitation, to review documentation. And I have 4 men stationed at the doors of this property tonight, which means that neither you nor your employer is going anywhere before that meeting takes place." Grout stared at him. "You may return to your room," Ashfern said, "or you may attempt to leave and discover very quickly that you cannot. The choice is yours." The silence in the hallway lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then Grout turned and walked back through the service door without another word. The hallway was quiet. I let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere very deep. Ashfern turned to me, and for the first time since I had known him, the composure was entirely gone. He crossed the hallway in 3 steps, and his hands came up to hold my face, both of them, warm and steady against my cold cheeks. And he looked at me with an expression so unguarded and so honest that it was almost difficult to look at directly. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No," I said. He exhaled. His eyes closed for just a moment, and when they opened again, they were very dark and very close. "I told you to stay close to the Countess," he said softly. "And I told you," I said, equally softly, "that I would not pretend I had not seen things." Something moved across his face, something that had been building since a dark hallway, and an elbow, and 2 words spoken in the dark. "Coretta," he said. My name. Just my name. But the way he said it made it sound like something he had been holding carefully for a long time and had finally decided to put down. "We should go back," I whispered. "There are still too many people." "Yes," he said, but he did not move for another moment. Then, carefully, he lowered his hands from my face, straightened, put the composure back on like a coat. But his eyes, when they met mine, did not go cold again. They stayed warm. We went back to the house separately, as always, as was necessary. But this time, when I reached my corridor and turned to go to my room, I glanced back once. He was standing at the far end of the hall, watching me go, making sure I arrived safely. I turned away before he could see me smile. Lord Pemwick came to breakfast the next morning, wearing his charm-like armor. He was the first gentleman down, which was unusual, and he positioned himself at the table with the easy confidence of a man who had spent the night recalibrating and arrived at a conclusion that satisfied him. He greeted the early arrivals warmly, commented pleasantly on the morning, and accepted his coffee with a gracious nod to the footman. He did not know, yet, that the net had already closed. I was not at the breakfast table. I was in the Countess's sitting room, helping her with her morning letters, when Mrs. Vance appeared at the door. She came in quietly, closed the door behind her, and looked at the Countess with an expression that was gentle and serious at once. "Delphine," she said, and the use of the Countess's given name shifted the atmosphere of the room immediately. "There is something you need to know about one of your guests." The Countess looked up from her letter. She was a perceptive woman, the kind who had navigated decades of social complexity with a sharp and practical intelligence. She read Mrs. Vance's expression in one moment and set her letter down. "Tell me," she said. Mrs. Vance told her. Clearly, concisely, without embellishment. She told her about Pemwick, about the evidence, about the magistrate arriving at 9. She told her about my father. She told her about what Grout had been sent to do the night before. The Countess listened without interrupting. When Mrs. Vance finished, the room was very quiet. Then the Countess looked at me. "Your father," she said softly. "Yes, my lady," I said. She looked at me for a long moment, with an expression I had not seen from her before. Not the brisk, practical gaze of an employer, but something warmer and more personal. Something that looked very much like sorrow. "I liked your father," she said quietly. "He was a good man." My throat closed. I nodded. She rose from her chair with the decisive energy of a woman who had made up her mind. "Then let us make sure this is done correctly," she said. The magistrate, a composed and thorough man named Mr. Aldous Reach, arrived at 3 minutes past 9. He was shown into the Countess's private study by a footman who had been briefed, and Ashburn was already inside, waiting, with Mrs. Vance beside him and a leather case of documents on the desk. I was not in the room. My father's letters were, though. Mrs. Vance had retrieved them from where she had kept them sewn into the lining of her traveling trunk for 4 years, and they sat on that desk in a neat stack, my father's careful handwriting facing upward. I stood in the hallway outside and I held myself very still. Inside the study, Ashburn walked Mr. Reach through 4 years of careful, methodical evidence. The financial records tracing payments from Pemwick's accounts through intermediaries to men whose services were particular and permanent. The testimony Mrs. Vance could give directly. My father's letters, which did not name Pemwick explicitly but described, in the coded language of a careful man, a series of events and transactions that placed alongside the financial records made the picture undeniable. And then there was Grout. Grout, who had spent the night locked in his room by the quiet and efficient men Ashburn had stationed at the property doors, had by morning made the calculation that many men in his position eventually make. Pemwick had always treated him as expendable. Pemwick had never once, in their years of association, taken any action that would protect Grout if things went wrong. Grout talked. He talked for a long time. By 10:30, Mr. Reach had heard enough. Lord Pemwick was in the drawing-room with Lady Silvara Cheston when 2 of Mr. Reach's accompanying officers appeared in the doorway. The conversation he was having stopped mid-sentence. His coffee cup was halfway to his mouth. I was not there to see it. I heard it described afterward by Mrs. Honoria Gratch, who had been sitting across the room and whose hearing, when something genuinely interesting was happening, turned out to be entirely sharp. She said that Pemwick had gone very still, that the charm had not dropped all at once, but had simply drained out of his face gradually, like color leaving something that had been cut, until what remained was the flat, cold calculation underneath. That he had set his coffee cup down carefully, stood, and gone with the officers without a word, which she found more frightening than any protest would have been. Lady Silvara Cheston had watched him go and then resumed her tea, as though the interruption had been mildly inconvenient. The house rearranged itself around his absence. There was shock, there was whispered conversation, there was the particular social electricity of people who have just discovered that something significant has happened and are working out what it means for them personally. The Aldbourne sisters clung together for once, without any competition between them, united by the simple human instinct to find comfort in familiarity when the ground shifts. Callum Reeves turned out to be genuinely kind, moving quietly through the disrupted morning to check on people without making a performance of it. which raised him considerably in my estimation. Mr. Tobias Fenwick, the solicitor who had spent the entire gathering looking like a man who had made a terrible mistake in attending, turned out to have attended for exactly that reason. He had been Ashburn's legal contact inside the gathering, present to advise on the process of submitting the evidence to the magistrate. His air of misery had been cover, and rather convincing cover at that. Lady Rosamond found me in the corridor an hour after Pemwick had been taken. I had been bracing for this, in a vague way, without knowing exactly what I was bracing for. She was beautiful and composed, and she looked at me with those watchful eyes that I now understood had been watchful from the beginning. "You are Dr. Blaine's daughter," she said. "Yes," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "Then, my husband died 3 years ago. The official cause was a sudden illness." She paused. "He had recently had a dispute with Lord Pemwick over a business arrangement. The implications settled between us like something heavy. I came to this gathering," she said, "because I heard through a careful set of connections that someone was finally building a case. I came to help if I could." She glanced toward the study door at the end of the corridor. "It appears I was not needed." "You were present," I said. "That matters." She looked at me with an expression that was complicated and honest, and briefly showed how tired she was underneath all that elegant composure. "Yes," she said quietly, "I suppose it does. We did not become instant friends. We were too different, too careful, too shaped by very different versions of loss and survival. But something real passed between us in that corridor. Something that felt like the beginning of a mutual respect that might, with time, become more. I found Ashburn in the library. Of course I did. He was standing at the window, looking out at the garden, and he turned when I came in. He looked tired in the way he had looked tired that first morning at the garden wall, but the grief in his posture was different now, lighter, like something that had been pressing down for a long time had finally been lifted enough to breathe under. "It is done," I said. "It is done," he agreed. I walked to the window and stood beside him. Below us, the garden was pale and wintry, the bare oak tree visible in the far corner, the stone bench where we had sat, and he had told me the truth about my father, still and cold in the morning air. "He will stand trial," Ashburn said. "The evidence is sufficient. Grout's testimony makes it more than sufficient. Reach is thorough and honest. It will be handled properly." "Grout's and my father," I said. "Will it be acknowledged? What happened to him?" "Yes," he said. "It will be part of the case. His name will be cleared. His death will be recorded for what it was." He paused. "He will not be forgotten, Coretta." I pressed my lips together and looked at the garden and let that be enough for a moment. Let myself feel the full weight of it. 4 years of a truth I had almost known, but had not let myself fully believe, because believing it, without being able to do anything about it, was too unbearable. And now the truth had been spoken aloud in an official room by official people, and my father's quiet, principled, dangerous life had been seen and recorded and would matter. It was enough. It was more than enough. "Thank you," I said. My voice was rough. "Do not thank me," he said. "He was my physician and my friend. I owed him this long before you and I ever met in a dark hallway." A small sound escaped me that was almost a laugh and almost something else. "I elbowed you," I said. "You did," he said, and I heard it in his voice. That thing that was not quite a smile but lived in the same place, squarely. "You told me to do it again. I meant it," he said. He turned from the window to look at me, and his expression was fully open in the way it had only been in unguarded moments. In dark hallways and cold gardens and quiet libraries, no one had surprised me in a very long time. I had stopped expecting to be surprised. I had stopped expecting a great many things. And now?" I asked. He looked at me steadily. "Now, I find myself in the unfamiliar position of wanting things I had decided were not available to me. What things? I asked. My heart was doing something entirely unreasonable. A reason to stay in rooms rather than leave them, he said quietly. A person worth talking to honestly rather than carefully. Someone who elbows dukes in dark hallways and then demands to be part of dangerous plans and stands in cold gardens at dawn to hear difficult truths without flinching. He paused. You, Coretta. I mean you. Specifically and entirely. The library was very quiet. Outside, a pale winter sun was making its way through the gray and beginning, tentatively, to touch the garden with something that looked like warmth. I am a physician's daughter, I said. I have no fortune, no title, no... If you finish that sentence, he said, I will be forced to point out that you have said some version of it to me 3 times now, and each time it has failed entirely to produce the effect you intend. I stopped. Which effect do I intend? I asked. Distance, he said simply, and it does not work, because I am not interested in your fortune or your title. I am interested in you, the specific, actual, elbow-wielding, honest, brave, infuriating you. I looked at him, at his tired, open, genuine face, at the man who had spent 4 years quietly pursuing justice for my father, while I had been pressing linens and refilling almond dishes and trying to take up as little space in the world as possible. You are a duke, I said. One last attempt, quieter than the others. I am aware, he said. It has not stopped me from thinking about you since a hallway and an elbow and 3 words. Don't creep up on me, I said softly. Do it again, he replied. And we were both quiet for a moment, and the distance between us was very small, and the winter sun was coming through the window properly now, laying itself across the floor of the library in long, warm strips. What happens now? I asked. Now, he said, I would like, with your permission, to speak to you properly, honestly. Not in stolen moments in back corridors, but openly, I would like to call on you. I would like to write to you. I would like to learn every single thing about you that there is to know, and I would like to do it without any of this careful separation between us. That will cause talk, I said. Undoubtedly, he agreed. People will say all sorts of things. They will, he said. I find I cannot make myself care about that as much as I should. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said, my father would have liked you. Something shifted in his face, something deep and quiet and very moved. I think, he said carefully, that is the finest thing anyone has said to me in years. I turned back to the window, stood beside him in the pale growing warmth of the winter sun. Our hands were close on the windowsill, not touching, not yet, but close in the way that things are close when the distance between them is a choice rather than a fact. I accept, I said quietly. The calling, the letters, the learning of things. All of it? He said. All of it, I said. Outside, the garden was still and quiet. The oak tree stood bare and patient. The stone bench waited in the corner where 2 people had sat in the cold before dawn and decided, without either of them quite saying so, that they were no longer willing to face the world alone. The gathering ended 2 days later. Guests departed in carriages down the gravel drive, taking their trunks and their dramas and their social performances back to London. The Aldbourne sisters left still in their temporary ceasefire, and Callum Reeves managed to hand Petra a folded note as he handed her into her carriage, which Faye pretended not to see. Mrs. Honoria Gratch declared the entire fortnight the most magnificent gathering she had ever attended, and said she had heard every moment of it perfectly. Mr. Tobias Fenwick left looking, for the first time, like a man who had accomplished something he had set out to do. Lady Rosamond said goodbye to me in the entrance hall. She pressed my hand briefly and said nothing, but her eyes said that she intended to pursue her own truth about her husband's death now that the door had been opened, and that she expected to succeed. I believed her. Mrs. Vance held both my hands in hers and looked at me with those sharp green eyes gone soft. "He would be so proud of you," she said. I did not trust my voice, so I simply held her hands tighter. She smiled, patted my cheek the way my father used to when I was small, and walked out to her carriage with her back straight and her step sure. 4 years of a kept promise finally delivered. Ashburn was the last to leave. He came to say goodbye to the Countess formally, properly, with all the correct social architecture in place. The Countess received him with great warmth and told him he was welcome at Morrow House at any time, which she had never said to anyone before, and which told me she understood more about the last fortnight than she had let on. He found me in the entrance hall as he was leaving. There were staff nearby, trunks being loaded, doors being held, the ordinary noise of departure. No dark hallway, no cold garden, no library privacy. He stopped in front of me and looked at me in the full light of an open door, with winter sun coming through it, and he was entirely composed and entirely unguarded at the same time. "Miss Blaine," he said. "Your Grace," I said. "I will write," he said. "I will reply," I said. He held my gaze for a moment longer. Then he inclined his head, the way a duke inclines his head to someone he is treating with genuine respect rather than social performance, and he walked out to his carriage. I stood in the doorway and watched the carriage move down the gravel drive. I watched it reach the gate. I watched it turn onto the road and disappear between the winter trees. Behind me, the Countess appeared at my shoulder. "Well," she said pleasantly, "that was the most interesting gathering I have ever hosted." I smiled and said nothing. She patted my arm and went back inside. I stayed in the doorway 1 moment longer. The road was empty now. The trees were still. The winter air was cold on my face, and the pale sun was warm on my hands. My father had been seen. His truth had been spoken. His name would be cleared. And somewhere down that road, a composed and careful and thoroughly unsettled duke was sitting in his carriage, very probably thinking about dark hallways and elbows, and a physician's daughter who had refused, at every possible turn, to be invisible. I stepped back inside and closed the door. The first letter arrived 4 days later. It was long and honest, and written in a hand that was small and precise and controlled, except in 3 places, where the pen had pressed slightly harder, where the words had come faster than the careful man writing them had quite intended. I read it twice. Then I sat down at the small writing desk in my room, opened my ink, and began to write back. Outside my window, London was gray and busy and loud. But inside that small room, something quiet and certain and entirely new was beginning. And this time, I was not afraid of it. I was ready.